Welcome to African Folktales by Tammy. Please don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more interesting stories. Also share this story to someone who might be interested. Let's get into the story. In the picturesque town of Ravenshire, nestled deep in the African countryside, life moved at a slow and steady pace. The town was surrounded by lush green fields and rolling hills, a tranquil place where everyone knew everyone. It was here that Margaret Blythe and her husband, Edward Blythe, had built a simple yet happy life on their modest farm. They were well loved by the townsfolk, who admired Edward for his hard-working nature and Margaret for her kindness and humility. Margaret was the epitome of grace, with soft brown eyes that seemed to see the good in everyone, and a warm smile that never failed to brighten even the darkest of days. She worked tirelessly alongside Edward, tending to the crops, milking the cows, and ensuring their small home was a place of love and comfort. Despite their lack of children, their bond was strong, and their laughter often echoed through the farm, a testament to the joy they shared in one another's company. Edward often spoke of his younger brother, Richard, who had left Ravenshire for the city years ago. Richard was the opposite of Edward, charming but aimless, full of dreams but unwilling to work for them. Edward harbored no resentment, however, and always believed Richard had potential. Margaret, too, had come to care for Richard in her own way, though she had only met him briefly during her wedding. She trusted Edward's judgment and believed that Richard could someday make something of himself. Life for the Blythes seemed idyllic, but as the seasons changed, so did their fortunes. One bitter winter, Edward fell gravely ill. It began with a persistent cough that worsened with each passing day. Margaret tried everything, herbal remedies, visits from the local healer, and endless prayers, but nothing seemed to help. Edward's once strong frame grew frail, and his voice, once filled with laughter, became weak and strained. Margaret stayed by his side day and night, holding his hand and whispering words of comfort. "You'll get better, Edward," she would say, though her heart ached with fear. Edward, ever the optimist, tried to reassure her. "If I don't, Margaret," he said one night, his voice barely a whisper, "promise me you'll look after Richard. He'll need you." Margaret's tears fell freely as she nodded, unable to find the words to argue. She promised, knowing in her heart she would do anything for the man she loved. Edward passed away on a cold January morning. The farm, once filled with life and laughter, felt eerily silent. Margaret buried her husband in the Ravenshire cemetery beside the ancient oak tree that he had loved so much. The townsfolk came to pay their respects, their faces heavy with sorrow. Edward had been a good man, and his loss was felt deeply by all who knew him. After the funeral, Margaret found herself alone in the farmhouse. The quiet was unbearable, but she threw herself into her work, tending to the crops and caring for the animals as best as she could. The farm was all she had left of Edward, and she was determined to keep it running in his memory. But without Edward's strength and guidance, it became clear that the farm would not survive for long. It was during this time of mourning that Margaret decided to honor Edward's final wish. She reached out to Richard, inviting him back to Ravenshire. When Richard arrived, he was the same charming but careless young man Margaret remembered. He greeted her with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, and a story about how hard life had been for him in the city. Margaret looked at him and saw not the man he was, but the man Edward had believed he could become. Despite her grief and the whispers of doubt from the townsfolk, she resolved to give Richard a chance. She sold part of the farmland, enough to pay for his education at the prestigious Wellington Academy, and sent him off with her blessing. The townsfolk were divided in their opinions. Some admired Margaret's generosity, calling her a saint for her sacrifices. Others were less kind, whispering behind her back that Richard was undeserving and that Margaret was setting herself up for disappointment. But Margaret paid them no mind. For her, this was not just about Richard, it was about keeping Edward's memory alive and fulfilling the promise she had made to him. As Richard left Ravenshire for Wellington Academy, Margaret stood by the gate of the farmhouse, waving him off with a faint smile. The wind carried with it the first hints of spring, a reminder that life, though painful, must go on. Little did she know, the seeds of betrayal were already being sown, and her loyalty would lead her down a path she could never have foreseen. Richard Blythe arrived at Wellington Academy like a fish out of water. The grand ivy-covered walls of the prestigious institution stood in stark contrast to the simplicity of Ravenshire. Here, young men and women from wealthy families strolled through stone courtyards, discussing politics and literature, their voices filled with entitlement. Richard, however, was not intimidated. His charm and quick wit made him a natural fit, and within months he had wormed his way into the inner circle of the school's elite. Back in Ravenshire, Margaret worked tirelessly to send him money. She sold more of the farm's land, her once expansive fields now reduced to a fraction of their original size. When the money from the land ran out, she took on extra work, mending clothes, baking bread, and even cleaning the homes of wealthier townsfolk. The whispers about her sacrifices grew louder. "She's working herself to death for that boy," said Agnes Carter, the town's gossip, to her friends one market day. "Doesn't she see what he's really like? Richard's only looking out for himself." But Margaret silenced these voices in her mind. Every time she received a letter from Richard, detailing his progress and thanking her for her generosity, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She kept those letters in a small wooden box, reading them on lonely nights to remind herself that her sacrifices were not in vain. Richard, however, was changing in ways Margaret could not see. At Wellington, he learned more than just the law. He learned how to manipulate people, how to win trust, and how to exploit it. He gained the favor of influential professors and students, not because of his talent, but because of his ability to say the right things at the right time. His charm opened doors, and soon he was rubbing shoulders with people who had the power to shape his future. One summer, during a brief break from his studies, Richard returned to Ravenshire. Margaret was overjoyed to see him and prepared a feast with what little she had. The farmhouse was no longer the bustling place it had once been. The fields were smaller and the animals fewer, but Margaret didn't let Richard see her struggles. She wanted him to feel proud of the sacrifices she had made. "Look at you," Margaret said as she placed a steaming plate of stew before him. "A fine young man." "Edward would be so proud," Richard smiled, but it was a hollow gesture. "I couldn't have done it without you, Margaret," he said smoothly. "I'll never forget what you've done for me." Margaret believed him. That night she sat by the fireplace, knitting by the dim light as Richard regaled her with stories of the city and his plans for the future. "Once I'm settled," he told her, "I'll come back and help you rebuild the farm. It's the least I can do." Tears welled in Margaret's eyes. "You're a good man, Richard. I always knew you'd make something of yourself." But in truth, Richard had no intention of returning to Ravenshire. To him, the town was a relic of a past he was eager to leave behind. The farm, the sacrifices, even Margaret herself, they were stepping stones on his path to success. He didn't see Margaret as family anymore. She was a means to an end, a debt he had no intention of repaying. After that visit, Richard's letters became less frequent. When they did arrive, they were curt and impersonal, filled with vague promises and reassurances. Margaret convinced herself that he was simply busy, working hard to secure his future. She took pride in his accomplishments, though the distance between them grew with each passing year. By the time Richard graduated at the top of his class and became a lawyer, Margaret's farm had dwindled to little more than a cottage and a garden. Her once strong frame had grown frail from years of labor, but she held on to hope. She dreamed of the day Richard would return to Ravenshire, bringing prosperity and pride to the Blythe name. But Richard was now a man of the city. His success had made him arrogant, and the values instilled by Edward and Margaret were long forgotten. In his mind, Margaret's sacrifices were a burden he had finally cast off. He was ready to move forward, leaving Ravenshire and the woman who had given up everything for him behind. Little did Margaret know, Richard's betrayal was just beginning. Margaret's patience and hope for Richard's return to Ravenshire seemed unshakable. Even as her body grew weaker from years of relentless labor, she clung to the belief that her sacrifices had not been in vain. She imagined Richard walking back into the small, dilapidated cottage that now served as her home, bringing with him news of success and promises to help rebuild the life she had lost for his sake. One summer morning, as Margaret tended to her small garden, a letter arrived. The handwriting on the envelope was unmistakable. It was from Richard. Her heart fluttered with joy as she eagerly opened it. Inside, Richard wrote about an important legal matter involving their family's estate. He explained that certain documents needed her signature to finalize the inheritance from Edward's father, Sir Harold Blythe. Richard assured her it was merely a formality to secure their remaining assets. Margaret, trusting Richard completely, didn't hesitate. She signed the papers and sent them back with the messenger. She saw this as another step toward the brighter future Richard had promised, a future where the Blythe name would once again flourish, and her sacrifices would finally bear fruit. Weeks passed, and Margaret heard nothing more from Richard. She grew worried but dismissed her doubts, convincing herself that he was busy with his legal work. Then one fateful day she received a visit from Mr. Hargrove, a local land agent. He informed her with a look of discomfort that the Blythe farm had been sold to a wealthy family from the neighboring town. Margaret was stunned. "That can't be," she said, her voice trembling. "This land, this farm, it's all I have left." "I'm sorry, Mrs. Blythe," Mr. Hargrove said gently, "but the sale is final. The documents were signed and approved by your brother-in-law, Richard Blythe." The words hit Margaret like a thunderclap. Her hands shook as she tried to process the betrayal. The land she had worked tirelessly to preserve, the home she had shared with Edward, the legacy they had built together, it was all gone. She had trusted Richard, given him everything, and he had repaid her with deceit. The townsfolk were quick to hear of the betrayal. Whispers filled the market square, where Margaret had once been a respected figure. Some pitied her, others mocked her naivety. Agnes Carter, the town gossip, didn't hold back. "I told her," she said loudly one day, "that boy was no good from the start. And now look where it's gotten her, penniless and alone." Margaret withdrew from the world, retreating to the small cottage that had been spared in the sale. She refused to believe that Richard could have acted out of malice. There must be a misunderstanding, she told herself. Richard would never. He wouldn't do this to me. But the truth was undeniable. Richard had taken everything. The funds from the sale of the farm had allowed him to expand his law practice in the city, securing his place among the wealthy elite. For Richard, Margaret was no longer a part of his life, just a shadow of the past he had left behind. Days turned into weeks, and Margaret's despair deepened. She wrote to Richard begging for an explanation, but no reply ever came. The betrayal weighed heavily on her, not just because of the loss of the farm, but because it shattered her belief in loyalty and family. Edward's final wish to care for Richard had been her guiding light, and now it felt like a cruel joke. Despite her pain, Margaret tried to rebuild her life. She worked odd jobs around Ravenshire, mending clothes and baking bread for the townsfolk. But her strength was fading, and the burden of her sacrifices had taken its toll. The once vibrant woman who had been the heart of the Blythe family was now a shadow of herself, her spirit broken by betrayal. As rumors of Richard's success in the city reached Ravenshire, Margaret's name became synonymous with unrequited loyalty. Some saw her as a fool, others as a martyr, but no one could deny the tragedy of her story, a woman who had given everything for someone who had taken it all without a second thought. And so Margaret's world grew smaller. The farm was gone, her family was gone, and the hope that had sustained her for so long had withered away. Little did she know, her struggles were far from over. Her body, weakened by years of sacrifice and heartbreak, was beginning to betray her as well. Margaret Blythe's days became a monotonous cycle of toil and exhaustion. The small cottage she now called home was a far cry from the sprawling Blythe farm that she and Edward had lovingly nurtured for years. The walls were cracked, the roof leaked whenever it rained, and the air inside was cold and damp. But it was all Margaret had left. She worked tirelessly, mending clothes for the townsfolk, baking loaves of bread to sell at the market, and taking on any odd job that could earn her a few coins. The people of Ravenshire had mixed reactions to her plight. Some sympathized with her and offered what little help they could spare. Eleanor Whittaker, the town's healer, often stopped by with herbs and remedies, urging Margaret to rest and take care of herself. but Margaret would only smile faintly and shake her head. "There's no time for rest, Eleanor," she would say. "There's always work to be done." Others, like Agnes Carter, were less kind. "She's paying the price for her foolishness," Agnes would mutter at the market. Trusting that scoundrel Richard. She might as well have handed him the farm on a silver platter. Margaret overheard these whispers but refused to let them break her. She had long since learned to endure the sting of pity and judgment. What hurt more was the growing realization that Richard would never return, not to help, not to explain, not to make amends. His silence was louder than any words could have been. As the seasons changed, Margaret's health began to decline. Her once strong frame grew frail, her hands trembling as she worked. The endless labor and years of sacrifice had taken their toll on her body, and the cold, damp conditions of her cottage only worsened her condition. Yet she pressed on, unwilling to let her struggles defeat her. One day, while selling bread at the market, Margaret overheard a group of townsfolk discussing Richard. They spoke of his rising success in the city, his grand new home, and the influential clients he now represented. Margaret's heart ached not with anger or resentment, but with deep, unshakable sorrow. She had given up everything for Richard, and yet he had forgotten her. "That's Richard Blythe for you," one man said. "Climbed to the top without looking back. I hear he's made quite a name for himself." Margaret forced a smile and continued selling her bread, but the weight of those words stayed with her. That evening, as she sat alone in her cottage, she stared at the small wooden box that held Richard's old letters. She hadn't opened it in months, but now, driven by some faint hope, she carefully lifted the lid and unfolded one of the letters. The words, once so full of gratitude and promise, now felt hollow. Margaret read the lines over and over, searching for the Richard she had believed in, but he was gone. The man who had written those letters no longer existed, or perhaps he never had. As the months passed, Margaret's condition worsened. She tried to hide her illness from the townsfolk, unwilling to burden them with her troubles. But her pale complexion and labored breathing did not go unnoticed. Eleanor Whittaker visited more frequently, bringing warm meals and urging Margaret to rest. "You can't keep going like this, Margaret," Eleanor said one evening, her voice filled with concern. "You've done more than enough." But Margaret only shook her head. "It's not enough, Eleanor. Edward believed in Richard, and so did I. If I gave up now, what would that say about everything we worked for?" Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, but she said nothing. She knew Margaret's determination was unshakable, even as her body grew weaker by the day. By the end of the year, Margaret was struggling to complete even the simplest tasks. Her neighbors began leaving small gifts of food and firewood outside her door, a silent acknowledgement of her resilience and an effort to ease her burden. Margaret accepted these offerings with gratitude, but the spark that had once defined her was fading. One bitterly cold morning, Margaret collapsed while tending to her small garden. A passing neighbor, Thomas Green, found her and carried her back to the cottage. Eleanor was summoned immediately, and as she examined Margaret, her expression grew grim. "You need rest, Margaret," Eleanor said firmly, "and warmth. Your body can't take much more of this." But Margaret only smiled faintly. "I'll be fine," she whispered. "I just need a little time." Deep down, however, Margaret knew the truth. Her body was failing her, and no amount of rest or remedies could change that. As she lay in her bed that night, staring at the flickering flame of a single candle, she whispered a prayer. She prayed for strength, for peace, and most of all for Richard, that he might someday understand the true meaning of loyalty and sacrifice. Margaret drifted into a restless sleep, her heart heavy with sorrow, but her spirit unbroken. Despite everything she had endured, she remained the same kind, selfless woman Ravenshire had always known. And though her body was weak, her love for Edward and her faith in the Blythe name refused to die. Margaret Blythe's health continued to decline as the harsh winter swept through Ravenshire. The once strong widow, who had tirelessly worked to support her late husband's brother, was now confined to her small, crumbling cottage. The townsfolk, who had watched her sacrifice so much, grew quieter in their whispers. What had once been pity or judgment became a solemn respect for the woman who had given all she had to a cause that had betrayed her. The visits from Eleanor Whittaker, the town healer, became more frequent. Eleanor often brought warm soup and kind words, though she knew they could do little to restore Margaret's health. One evening, as Eleanor stoked the small fire in the hearth, she turned to Margaret, who lay pale and frail on the old wooden bed. "You've done more than anyone could have asked," Eleanor said gently. "It's time to rest, Margaret. You've given enough." Margaret, her voice barely more than a whisper, shook her head. "I can't, Eleanor, if I stop now. What would Edward think of me? I promised him I would look after Richard. I promised." Eleanor's eyes welled with tears, but she said nothing. She knew Margaret's devotion to Edward's memory was unshakable. It was both her greatest strength and her greatest burden. Word of Margaret's condition spread through Ravenshire, and the townsfolk began leaving small offerings at her doorstep, baskets of firewood, jars of preserves, and loaves of bread. These gifts were their way of showing gratitude for the years of kindness Margaret had shown them, even as she endured her own struggles. One morning, as Margaret lay in bed, she heard a knock at the door. With great effort, she called out, "Come in." To her surprise, it was Thomas Green, a local farmer who had always admired her resilience. He carried a small wooden box, which he placed gently on the table beside her bed. "I found this while clearing out the old Blythe fields," Thomas said softly. "Thought you might want it." Margaret opened the box with trembling hands. Inside was a bundle of dried wildflowers and a small carving Edward had made years ago, a simple heart with their initials etched into it. Tears streamed down her face as she held the carving close to her chest. "Thank you, Thomas," she said, her voice breaking. "This means more to me than you'll ever know." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Margaret called Eleanor to her side. She asked her to write a letter, her final words to Richard. Though her strength was fading, her resolve was clear. "Tell him," she began, her voice steady despite her frailty, "that I never hated him. Tell him I forgave him even before he betrayed me. But also tell him this: loyalty is not something you take for granted. It is a gift and it must be earned." Eleanor wrote the letter with tears in her eyes, sealing it and promising to send it to Richard. Margaret smiled faintly. The weight of her final message lifted from her heart. "Thank you, Eleanor," she whispered, "for everything." That night Margaret passed away peacefully, the small wooden carving still clutched in her hand. The townsfolk, upon hearing the news, gathered to mourn the woman who had given everything for love and loyalty. They decided to honor her in a way befitting her legacy. Margaret was buried beside Edward under the old oak tree in the Ravenshire cemetery. The townsfolk pooled their resources to give her a proper burial, ensuring she would be remembered for generations to come. Her gravestone was simple but poignant, inscribed with the words, "Here lies Margaret Blythe, a heart that gave until it could give no more." At the funeral, Eleanor read aloud Margaret's letter to Richard, ensuring her final words would be heard by all. Though Richard himself was not there, the townsfolk felt the weight of her message. It was a lesson in loyalty, sacrifice, and the price of betrayal. Far away in the city, Richard received the letter weeks later. By then, news of Margaret's death had reached him, but he had done nothing to acknowledge it. As he read her words, a pang of guilt pierced his heart. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of what he had done. The image of Margaret, the woman who had sacrificed everything for him, haunted him. But it was too late for redemption. Richard's wealth and success, built on Margaret's sacrifices, brought him no peace. He lived the rest of his days in isolation, his name tarnished by rumors of his betrayal. Margaret's story became a legend in Ravenshire, told by firelight to generations of townsfolk. She was remembered not just as a victim of betrayal, but as a symbol of selflessness and loyalty. Her life, though filled with hardship, left an indelible mark on the hearts of those who knew her. And so the name Margaret Blythe lived on, a reminder of the beauty and tragedy of a love that gave until it could give no more. Long after Margaret Blythe was laid to rest beside her beloved Edward under the ancient oak tree in Ravenshire Cemetery, her story lived on in the hearts and minds of the townsfolk. Her life, filled with sacrifice and unwavering loyalty, became a tale passed down through generations, a story that carried lessons of love, betrayal, and the cost of selflessness. In Ravenshire, Margaret's cottage was left untouched for many years. The townsfolk, who had once pitied and judged her, now revered her memory. They often spoke of her kindness, her hard work, and the sacrifices she made for a man who had failed to honor her loyalty. Parents would point to the crumbling remains of her home and tell their children, "This is where Margaret Blythe lived, a woman who gave everything for her family." The younger generation grew up hearing her tale, which transformed into a legend over time. In the stories told by firelight, Margaret was depicted as a symbol of unyielding faith and resilience. Some called her a martyr, while others saw her as a tragic figure. But regardless of the interpretation, her name became synonymous with loyalty and sacrifice. Far away in the city, Richard Blythe's life built on Margaret's sacrifices began to crumble. For a time he had basked in the success of his legal career, his wealth affording him luxuries Margaret could only dream of. But as the years passed, the choices he had made began to catch up with him. His greed and arrogance alienated his clients, and his reputation as a lawyer deteriorated. Richard's betrayal of Margaret haunted him. He often dreamed of the day he last saw her standing by the gate of the farmhouse, waving him off with hope in her eyes. He remembered the sacrifices she had made, the land she had sold, and the promises he had broken. Her final letter, which he had read countless times, echoed in his mind. Loyalty is not something you take for granted. It is a gift, and it must be earned. His wealth dwindled, his connections vanished, and he found himself alone in a large, empty house. The success he had once pursued so ruthlessly felt hollow, and the memory of Margaret's kindness became a weight he could no longer bear. In his final years, Richard became a recluse, spending his days in solitude, tormented by regret. Back in Ravenshire, the townsfolk decided to honor Margaret's legacy in a permanent way. They erected a stone monument in the town square, inscribed with her name and the words, "In memory of Margaret Blythe, a heart that gave until it could give no more. May her sacrifice remind us of the power of love and loyalty." The monument became a place where people would gather to reflect on her story. Farmers would touch the stone for good luck before heading to their fields, and children would leave small flowers at its base, a tradition started by their parents. Margaret's story became more than just a tale of betrayal. It became a symbol of the strength of the human spirit and the enduring power of love. As the years turned into decades, the world around Ravenshire changed. The fields grew smaller as modernity crept into the countryside, but the story of Margaret Blythe remained. In schools, teachers would recount her life as a lesson in morality, emphasizing the importance of gratitude and the dangers of greed. Families shared the tale during long winter nights, adding their own flourishes to the story. In some versions, Margaret's sacrifices brought a curse upon Richard, ensuring his downfall. In others, she was portrayed as a saint, her spirit watching over the town and blessing those who lived with integrity. No matter the version, the core of the story remained the same. Margaret Blythe was a woman who loved deeply, gave selflessly, and endured with grace, even in the face of betrayal. Though Margaret Blythe's life was marked by hardship, her memory became a source of inspiration for all who heard her tale. She was more than a widow who sacrificed for her brother-in-law. She was a symbol of resilience and unwavering loyalty. And so, in the quiet town of Ravenshire, where the seasons turned slowly and the old oak tree stood tall in the cemetery, Margaret's name lived on. It was whispered by the wind that rustled through the fields, carried in the laughter of children playing near her monument, and etched into the hearts of those who understood the beauty and tragedy of her life. Margaret Blythe's legacy was not one of wealth or power, but of love, a love so profound that it transcended betrayal and inspired generations to cherish the bonds of loyalty and the true meaning of sacrifice. Her story, immortalized in the fabric of Ravenshire, ensured that she would never be forgotten. We've come to the end of this story. Please subscribe to my channel to support me. Thank you.